Virginia, 1852. The sun was rising over the James River fields when a slave boy named Nathaniel whispered his first prayer for freedom. He didn't know it yet, but fate had already chosen the one creature that would carry him beyond the chains, an old horse named Grace. The sun rose slowly above the fields of Virginia, spreading thin gold light across the riverbanks and the sleeping rows of tobacco. The air was already warm, heavy with the smell of earth and smoke from the kitchen house. Behind the Carter plantation, in a long wooden stable that leaned toward the east, a 12-year-old boy named Nathaniel brushed the dust from the neck of an old horse. Her name was Grace. Her mane had turned gray, her ribs showed faintly beneath her hide, and her eyes carried a quiet wisdom that only age and sorrow could give. Nathaniel moved carefully, his bare feet making no sound on the straw. Every stroke of the brush was gentle, as though he were touching something sacred. To the other slaves, Grace was only an animal too weak for work. But to Nathaniel she was a friend, a secret, and a living memory of his mother. He had been born in these fields, though he could barely remember the cabin where he first opened his eyes. His mother had worked in the same stables before she died of fever when he was 6. She had loved this horse and often sang while she cleaned her hooves. Sometimes Nathaniel still imagined that Grace remembered the songs. When the boy whispered, the horse tilted her ears, listening as if the sound came from far beyond the years. Outside, the plantation stirred awake. The overseer's whistle cut through the morning air. Men and women filed toward the fields, their chains clinking faintly. Nathaniel stayed behind to finish his work. In the hush of the stable, he could pretend that the world beyond those doors did not exist. Here with Grace there was no shouting, no whip, only the soft rhythm of breath and the creak of wood. He had learned to speak softly because loud voices brought trouble. He had learned to run quietly because footsteps could betray him. But with Grace he didn't hide. He talked about the sky, the smell of rain, the stories he'd heard from old Isaac who worked at the forge. Isaac spoke of a river farther north where no man carried chains. Nathaniel liked to imagine it at night, silver under the moon, wide enough to wash away fear. "Someday," he whispered to Grace, "we'll find that river." The horse shifted, her tail flicking at a fly. He smiled. "You'll like it there. Plenty of grass. No fences." By noon the sun burned white above the fields. The air shimmered. Nathaniel carried water buckets from the well, his shoulders aching. When he returned to the stable, he found Mr. Dunley, the overseer, standing inside. Dunley was a tall, narrow man with a scar across his jaw and eyes the color of cold iron. He ran his hand along Grace's flank and clicked his tongue. "This one's finished," he said to the groom beside him. "Old bones. I'll have her sold tomorrow with the others. Maybe fetch a few dollars for hide." Nathaniel froze at the doorway. The bucket handle bit into his palms. He wanted to speak, but the words felt dangerous. Dunley noticed him. "What you staring at, boy?" Nathaniel lowered his head. "Nothing, sir." "Then move along." The overseer turned away. Nathaniel carried the bucket to the trough and poured the water slowly so his hands would not shake. Dunley left without another glance. Only when the sound of his boots faded did the boy step closer to Grace. She nuzzled his arm, unaware of the verdict that hung over her. "They can't take you," he whispered. "I won't let them." That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Nathaniel worked in silence, polishing harness buckles until they shone like copper fire. Nearby, old Isaac hammered iron in the fading light. The ring of metal echoed through the yard. "You best keep quiet about that horse," Isaac said without looking up. "Man like Dunley got no patience for sentiment." Nathaniel paused. "She was my mama's." "I know," Isaac muttered. "But knowing don't change what's coming. World don't favor kindness, boy. It favors obedience." Nathaniel swallowed hard. "Maybe the world wrong." The old man stopped hammering. For a moment the air trembled with heat and silence. Then he said softly, "Maybe it is, but it's bigger than you." Night settled thick and humid. The cabins glowed with small lamps. Nathaniel ate a crust of bread by the doorway and listened to frogs calling near the river. Above the trees lightning flickered, white veins across the sky. A storm was rolling in from the south. When the thunder began to grumble, he rose and slipped toward the stable. Inside, the air was cooler. Grace lifted her head, ears twitching. Nathaniel brought her the bread and a handful of corn stolen from the feed room. Rain started tapping the roof, slow at first, then heavier. "Don't be scared," he said, though she wasn't. He stroked her muzzle, feeling the warmth beneath the rough skin. Mama used to hum when it rained. "Remember?" He began to hum the tune, low and wavering. It wasn't much of a melody, but the rhythm filled the space like a heartbeat. Grace shifted closer, breathing softly against his cheek. Outside, the rain turned to sheets, pounding the roof until the sound drowned every thought. He sat down on the straw, hugging his knees. The smell of hay mixed with thunder and wet earth. He thought of the stories whispered between slaves at night, stories of men who had crossed the river and never come back, of stars that pointed north, of dogs that lost the scent when rain fell hard enough. He didn't know if any of it was true, but he wanted to believe. Lightning flashed through the gaps in the boards, illuminating the horse's face. For a heartbeat, her eyes seemed almost human, calm, steady, knowing. Nathaniel felt tears rise. "They'll sell you tomorrow," he said quietly. "I can't let them." His voice broke. "I won't," the thunder answered, deep and rolling. He leaned his head against her shoulder and closed his eyes. In his mind he saw the world beyond the river, open fields, forests that never ended. People who looked at him not as property, but as someone who could choose. The dream felt fragile, but it was all he had. He woke sometime before dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed and still. A thin mist clung to the ground. From outside came the muffled sound of footsteps, Dunley's voice barking orders, men preparing wagons. Nathaniel's heart began to hammer. He stood and looked at Grace. She blinked slowly, tired but calm. The first light of morning filtered through the cracks, turning the air pale blue. "I'll get you out," he whispered. "Before they come." He found the small wooden latch that kept the back gate closed. His fingers trembled as he lifted it. The hinge creaked. Grace shifted her weight, uncertain. "Quiet now," he said. "Just for a while." He led her a few steps into the yard, the mud cool beneath their feet. Mist wrapped around them like smoke. For a moment the world felt completely silent. Then a shout split the air. "Hey, boy, what are you doing?" It was Dunley. He came running from the house, whip in hand. Nathaniel froze. Grace snorted, sensing fear. "Get back," the overseer shouted. "You touch that horse again and I'll—" Before the words finished, Grace reared, startled by the sound. Nathaniel jumped aside as the whip cracked across the air. It missed him but struck the horse's flank. Grace bolted forward, breaking free from his grasp. The gate swung wide. She galloped toward the open field, mud flying beneath her hooves. Dunley cursed and ran after her. Nathaniel's heart pounded so hard he could hardly breathe. For an instant he wanted to chase her, to shout her name, but his voice caught. The whip cracked again, echoing like lightning. Then came the sound of hooves fading into distance. When the overseer returned, his face was red with fury. "You stupid boy," he hissed. "You'll pay for that." He grabbed Nathaniel by the arm and dragged him toward the barn wall. The whip rose once more. The first strike burned across the boy's back. The second made his knees buckle. He didn't cry out. Somewhere beyond the pain, he heard the distant thunder of hooves. He prayed it was Grace running far, far away. When it was over, he lay on the ground, dust mixing with blood. Dunley spat beside him and walked off. Nathaniel stayed still until the sound of boots disappeared. Then he rolled onto his side and looked toward the horizon. The mist had lifted, revealing a narrow strip of light where the sun was rising. "She's free," he whispered, tasting the salt of his own tears. She's free. He didn't know that Grace had not gone far. She had stopped at the edge of the woods, breathing hard, ears twitching toward the sound of his voice. When the light reached the trees, she turned her head back toward the plantation. Something in that small figure lying in the dirt called to her more strongly than fear or pain. Nathaniel pulled himself up slowly, every movement sharp with ache. He pressed his palm against the barn wall to steady himself. Above, the sky was wide and endless, pale as forgiveness. Somewhere a bird began to sing. He wiped his face with his sleeve and whispered again, "I won't let them take you." The promise hung in the air like smoke from the morning fires, rising and twisting toward the heavens. Neither the boy nor the horse knew it yet, but before the next sunset, that promise would bind their fates forever. The morning after the storm broke clear and cruel. The air was bright, too bright, the kind of light that shows every scar on the land. The fields shimmered with dew and smoke rose from the chimneys like pale ribbons. Nathaniel stood near the barn, his back raw and burning from the lashes, his hands trembling as he tried to lift a bucket. Each movement sent pain crawling across his shoulders, but he forced himself to keep going. Work was the only thing that kept the overseer's eyes from turning on him again. Grace was gone. The stall stood empty, straw scattered, a single broken rope hanging from the gate. No one had found her during the night. Some said she had run into the woods, others that she had fallen into the river. Mr. Dunley had ordered a search at dawn, but after an hour he lost interest. "A useless beast," he said. "Not worth the sweat." But to Nathaniel, the silence in that store was unbearable. Every sound reminded him of her absence: the clatter of buckets, the scrape of hooves, the low moan of wind through the boards. When he brushed the stalls of the other horses, he caught himself turning, expecting to see her eyes watching him from the corner. Instead, there was only emptiness. The other slaves avoided him that morning. They had seen the marks on his back. Some looked at him with pity, others with warning. Even old Isaac, who usually found words for every sorrow, said nothing. He only nodded once, his face grim, before turning back to his forge. By midday, the overseer called Nathaniel to the yard. The sun burned white overhead, and the ground was dry enough to crack underfoot. Dunley stood by a wagon hitched with 2 mules, holding a leather ledger. He gestured toward Nathaniel with his whip. "You're going with the cart," he said, "down to the river town. We're trading supplies for the master's house. You'll help load and unload, and you'll keep your mouth shut while you're there. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Nathaniel said quietly. Dunley's eyes narrowed. "And don't think I forgot what you did yesterday. You're lucky that old horse is gone. If she hadn't run, I'd have sold you with her." Nathaniel lowered his gaze. "Yes, sir." "Now move." They set out before noon. The cart creaked along the dirt road, flanked by endless rows of crops that shimmered under the sun. Nathaniel sat in the back with 2 older men, both silent, their faces expressionless. Every bump in the road jarred his wounds, but he made no sound. He watched the horizon, half hoping to see a shadow moving through the fields. The shape of a horse he knew too well. The journey to the river town took most of the day. They passed cabins and smokehouses, small groups of workers, and the slow gleam of the James River winding like a mirror through the valley. When they finally reached the town, the smell of tar and salt filled the air. Boats creaked along the docks, their sails bright against the sky. Nathaniel followed the men to the warehouse. They carried barrels of cornmeal and sacks of tobacco leaves. His back screamed with every lift, but he didn't stop. He didn't dare. Dunley watched from the shade, his whip coiled at his side like a snake. As the day wore on, the sky dimmed to amber. Nathaniel's arms shook with exhaustion. When the last barrel was rolled into place, Dunley ordered them to rest beside the river before heading back. Nathaniel sat on a log, dipping his hands into the cool water. The surface shimmered with sunset. For a moment he felt peace, thin, fragile peace that trembled like glass. Then he saw something across the river. A shape moved through the reeds, slow and uncertain. His heart stopped. The light caught the shape again, and this time there was no doubt. A horse, thin, limping slightly, its mane tangled, its coat grey with mud. Grace. Nathaniel stood so fast the log rolled behind him. The men shouted for him to sit down, but their voices blurred into noise. He stepped into the shallows, the cold biting his legs. "Grace," he whispered. "Grace, it's me." The horse lifted her head, ears flicking toward the sound. For a heartbeat she didn't move. Then she stepped forward, hooves splashing in the water. Dunley's shout cut through the air. "Boy, get back here!" Nathaniel didn't move. The river was wide, but not deep. He could almost reach her if he tried. The overseer's boot splashed behind him. A hand grabbed his collar, yanking him backward. "You lost your damn mind," Dunley roared. "That beast's not yours." "She's all I got," Nathaniel gasped. Dunley's whip struck before he finished the sentence. The pain ripped through him sharper than before. The second lash caught his arm, splitting skin. He stumbled into the water, choking on the taste of mud. The older slaves on the bank turned away. None dared to interfere. "Back to the cart!" Dunley shouted. "Now!" Nathaniel obeyed, blood mixing with river water on his skin. When he glanced over his shoulder, Grace was still there, standing on the far bank, her head lowered as if she understood. They left the town at dusk. The road wound through the hills, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Nathaniel sat in silence, holding his torn sleeve to his shoulder. His mind drifted between pain and memory. He saw his mother brushing Grace's mane, humming softly. He saw her turning to him, her face gentle but firm. "Don't ever let fear make you forget who you are," she had once said. The words echoed now, faint but unbroken. When they returned to the plantation, the moon was high. Dunley dismissed the men and sent Nathaniel to the cabins without another word. The boy staggered to his corner and lay down on the wooden floor. Every breath felt like fire. He didn't sleep. He listened to the distant hoot of an owl, to the murmur of wind through pine trees, to the faint creak of the stable door that no longer hid Grace. Somewhere beyond those woods, she was alive. He knew it. The thought filled him with something close to strength. At dawn, Dunley gathered everyone in the yard. The master was returning from Richmond, and everything had to look proper. Nathaniel was ordered to clean the carriage wheels. As he worked, his back stiffened each time he heard the overseer's boots behind him. "Boy," Dunley said after a while, "you'll be leaving this place soon. Master Carter's cousin needs more hands down in North Carolina." "I told him about you." Nathaniel froze. "Leaving?" "Tomorrow morning. We'll take you to the river crossing. You'll be sold with 3 others." The words fell like stones. He couldn't answer. Dunley smirked. "So you'll fetch a decent price if you keep your mouth shut. Maybe down there you'll learn not to chase animals like a fool." When the overseer walked away, Nathaniel sat back against the wheel. The world tilted slightly like a cart on uneven ground. Sold, taken south. Away from Grace. Away from the only place that still held his mother's memory. That night he couldn't eat. The thought of leaving twisted inside him like wire. Old Isaac found him sitting by the ashes of the fire. "You heard?" the blacksmith said quietly. Nathaniel nodded. Isaac lowered himself onto a log beside him. "Sometimes the Lord don't send signs, boy. Sometimes he sends choices." Nathaniel looked up. "What choice I got?" Isaac poked the embers with a stick. Sparks rose into the dark. "You can run. So you can bow your head and let the world break you. Both roads hard, but only one belongs to you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Nathaniel turned them over in his mind long after Isaac walked away. "Run." The word pulsed in his chest. He thought of the river, of Grace standing in the reeds. Maybe she was waiting. Maybe she hadn't left at all. He rose quietly and slipped into the shadows. The moonlight guided his steps toward the stable. The doors creaked open, revealing empty stalls and the faint smell of hay. He touched the place where Grace used to stand. "I'm coming," he whispered. He found a length of rope and a handful of corn from the feed bin. He didn't know what else to take. In the far corner, a small window looked toward the woods. The air outside shimmered with mist. Beyond those trees lay the river, and beyond the river maybe freedom. He waited until the yard fell silent, until the last lamp in the overseer's quarters went dark. Then he slipped out, keeping to the shadows along the fence line. His heart beat so loud he thought it might wake the world. The path to the river wound through tall grass that brushed his knees. Fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns. He moved fast, ignoring the sting of branches against his skin. Every few steps he glanced back, expecting to see torches, but there was nothing, only the whisper of the night and the sound of his own breath. When he reached the edge of the woods, he stopped to listen. The river murmured somewhere ahead, calm and endless. And then he heard it, a soft, distant snort followed by the shuffle of hooves on damp earth. "Grace?" he whispered. The sound came again, closer now. Out of the darkness a shadow took shape. Thin legs, a bowed head, eyes that caught the moonlight like silver. She had found him. Nathaniel stepped forward, tears burning his eyes. "You waited for me," he said. Grace whickered softly, as if in answer. Her body was marked with scratches, her coat dull with mud, but she was alive. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her neck. The warmth of her skin felt like forgiveness. Behind them, far off, a dog barked. Then another. Torches flared near the cabins. Shouts carried across the fields. Dunley had noticed his absence. Nathaniel looked toward the river, its surface shining faintly under the moon. "We have to go," he whispered. Grace pawed the ground, ready. He climbed onto her back, clutching her mane. For a moment, fear almost stopped him, the fear of failure, of capture, of the whip and the chain waiting if he fell. But then he remembered his mother's voice. "Don't ever let fear make you forget who you are." He pressed his heels gently against Grace's sides. She began to move, slow at first, then faster. her hooves pounding against the earth. The wind tore at his face, and the world narrowed to the rhythm of her stride. Behind them, shouts grew louder. Dogs barked. Torches flickered through the trees. But ahead lay the river, wide, dark, and calling. Nathaniel tightened his grip and whispered one final word. "Run!" The night air cut cold against Nathaniel's face as Grace carried him through the tall grass. The moon floated high and pale, caught in drifting clouds, and the fields behind them shimmered with torchlight as men shouted and dogs barked. Grace's hooves pounded the soft ground, flinging clumps of mud behind her. Nathaniel bent low, gripping her mane. The wind whipped his shirt open, stinging his skin where the lashes had not yet healed. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The sound of pursuit followed like thunder echoing across the empty plain. Every breath came sharp and quick. He whispered to the horse between gasps, "Keep going, girl. Keep going." The land sloped downward toward the river, and soon the smell of wet clay and moss filled the air. The river's voice grew louder, the rush of water against stone. Nathaniel knew it lay somewhere beyond the dark line of trees, wide and deep. If they could cross before dawn, they might have a chance. Grace slowed at the edge of the woods, her sides heaving. Her body trembled under him, soaked with sweat. Nathaniel slid down and pressed his forehead against her neck. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "We'll rest a moment." The forest was thick, alive with insects and the rustle of small animals. The moonlight barely pierced through the branches. Nathaniel led Grace between the trees, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves. Somewhere far off a dog barked again, then another answered. They were closing in. He found a clearing near the riverbank where the ground was soft and damp. Grace lowered her head to drink from a shallow puddle. Nathaniel crouched beside her, cupping his hands to drink as well. The water tasted of earth and roots, but it soothed his throat. He looked toward the horizon. The faintest grey light touched the east. Dawn was coming. Soon the sky would betray them. "Just a little farther," he said, stroking Grace's mane. "Once we cross, they can't follow." The horse lifted her head, ears twitching toward the sound of the river. Nathaniel led her forward, pushing through ferns and low branches. When they reached the bank, he stopped. The river was wider than he remembered, swollen from recent rains, dark and restless. The current moved fast, pulling at the reeds. He stood there, heart hammering. The stories he had heard whispered at night came flooding back. Men who tried to cross and never returned, bodies swept downstream to the sea. Behind him, the dogs barked again. The shouts grew clearer. He could almost hear Dunley's voice. "No time," Nathaniel whispered. "No time." He looked at Grace. Her eyes reflected the first streaks of dawn, calm, steady, waiting. He took the rope from his shoulder and tied it loosely around her neck. "We can do this," he said. "You carried me this far." Grace pawed the ground, then stepped forward into the shallows. The water swirled around her legs. Nathaniel climbed onto her back, gripping the rope with one hand and her mane with the other. The cold hit him like a blade. The river rose to her chest, then to his waist. "Easy," he whispered. "One step at a time." The current pressed hard against them. Grace pushed forward, muscles straining, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Nathaniel clung tightly, his eyes fixed on the far shore. Trees loomed there like dark sentinels. The water roared in his ears, drowning every other sound. Halfway across, the current caught them. Grace stumbled, her hooves slipping on hidden stones. Nathaniel felt the pull drag at his legs. Panic surged. He shouted her name, though the wind stole the sound. She fought to regain footing, nostrils flaring, water thrashing against her chest. "Come on, girl," he cried. "You can do it." She lunged forward, step by step, until the current eased. The far bank rose before them, slick with mud. With a final surge, Grace climbed onto the shore and collapsed to her knees, trembling. Nathaniel slid off and fell beside her, gasping for air. They had made it. He rolled onto his back, staring at the pale morning sky through the canopy of trees. His chest burned. His hands were numb, but his heart felt alive for the first time in his life. He turned to Grace, who lay breathing heavily, her sides quivering. "You saved me," he whispered. "So you did it." For a long while neither of them moved. The only sound was the soft rush of the river behind them, and the whisper of wind through the leaves. When Nathaniel finally stood, his legs shook. He looked back across the river, expecting to see torches, but the far bank was empty. The pursuit had stopped. The water had claimed the trail. He smiled weakly. They can't find us now, but freedom was still far away. Beyond the river stretched miles of wilderness. No cabins, no roads, only forest and hills. The stories said that somewhere north there were men who would help, houses with candles in their windows where runaways could rest. But those were only whispers, and whispers didn't feed an empty stomach. Nathaniel gathered dry twigs and leaves to make a small fire. It smoked weakly, giving little warmth. He tore a piece from his torn sleeve to clean the cuts on Grace's legs. "We'll rest today," he said softly. "When the sun goes down, we move again." He sat beside her, leaning against a tree. Exhaustion settled over him like a heavy blanket. The pain in his back dulled to a slow ache. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to close his eyes. When he woke, the sun was high and hot. The forest hummed with insects. Grace grazed nearby, nibbling on sparse grass between the roots. Nathaniel stretched and winced. His throat was dry, his stomach hollow. He tore a handful of berries from a bush and chewed them slowly, though they were bitter. Hours passed. The world turned golden again as evening approached. Nathaniel knew they couldn't stay here. The men might still be searching downstream. He rose and touched Grace's neck. "Time to go, girl." They followed a narrow path that wound north through the trees. The air grew heavy with moisture. Clouds gathered above the hills, dark and swollen. The wind began to stir. By the time they reached the open field beyond the woods, the sky had turned a bruised gray. Thunder rolled in the distance. Grace lifted her head, uneasy. Nathaniel looked up. "Just rain," he said, though he wasn't sure. They pressed on. The first drops fell like cold needles. Then the storm broke. Rain came in torrents, slashing across the land. Lightning split the horizon, illuminating the road ahead for an instant before plunging it back into darkness. Grace shied from the thunder but kept moving. Nathaniel clung to her mane, his hair plastered to his face. The storm grew wilder. The road turned to mud beneath them. Water poured from the hillsides, forming streams that crossed their path. Nathaniel could barely see. The wind screamed through the trees, tearing at his clothes. They reached a ridge where the land fell sharply toward another valley. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment he saw everything. The forest below, a crooked wooden bridge over a rushing creek, and beyond it, faint lights flickering through the storm. Shelter. "Hold on, Grace," he shouted. "Just a little more." They descended the slope, hooves slipping in the mud. The bridge swayed in the wind, boards creaking. Grace hesitated at the edge. Nathaniel leaned forward. "Easy, girl. We can make it." She stepped onto the bridge. It groaned under their weight but held. Halfway across, lightning struck a tree nearby, splitting it in two. The thunderclap was deafening. Grace reared, panicked, her hooves crashing against the planks. Nathaniel nearly lost his grip. "Grace!" he yelled. "Steady!" The bridge shook violently. For one terrifying moment he thought it would collapse. But then she leapt forward, reaching solid ground on the other side. They stumbled into the shelter of the trees, both gasping. Rain hammered down, relentless. Nathaniel spotted an old shack ahead, its roof half collapsed but still standing. He led Grace inside. The smell of damp wood and mold filled the air. They were safe for now. He found an old blanket in the corner, torn and stiff with age. He used it to dry her flanks, murmuring softly, "You're all right?" "You're safe." She lowered her head, resting her muzzle against his shoulder. He felt her breath, warm and steady, against his skin. The storm raged on outside. Water poured through cracks in the roof, pattering onto the dirt floor. Lightning lit the room again and again, each flash revealing fragments of the old place. A broken chair, a rusted kettle, spiderwebs thick as lace. Nathaniel sat down, pulling his knees close. "We'll keep going tomorrow," he said. "Maybe we'll find someone who'll help us. Maybe there's a road north." He looked at Grace. Her eyes reflected the dim light, calm and full of trust. That look gave him strength he didn't understand. He thought of his mother again, of her voice in the stables, her laughter on quiet mornings before the world had turned cruel. He remembered the night she died, the fever burning through her like wildfire. He had been too young to understand, but he remembered her last words. "Find the light, Nathaniel. Even in the dark, find the light." Now sitting in that ruined shack, soaked and trembling, he finally understood what she had meant. The light wasn't in the sky or in the world outside. It was in this, in the breath of a living creature beside him, in the promise that he would not surrender, not yet. The rain began to ease. The thunder faded into distant rumbles. Nathaniel rose and pushed the door open. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and wet soil. The storm clouds drifted apart, revealing a slice of moonlight breaking through. He stepped outside, tilting his face to the cool air. The forest glistened with silver drops. Grace followed, her hooves soft against the mud. Together they stood beneath the clearing sky. Nathaniel looked north where the stars were faint but steady. "We keep moving," he said. "Tomorrow we find that road." Grace flicked her tail and nickered softly as if she agreed. He smiled, though his lips were cracked and his body ached. The wind brushed through the trees, carrying the scent of distant rain and something new. The faint, fragile smell of freedom. And in that quiet, between thunder and dawn, the boy and the horse stood side by side, waiting for the light to return. Dawn crept over the valley like a slow breath, pale light filtering through mist that hung low over the trees. Nathaniel woke to the sound of dripping water and the faint murmur of the creek below the hill. His body ached from sleep on the hard ground. Grace stood near the doorway of the old shack, her head bowed, steam rising faintly from her body in the chill morning air. For a while, he just watched her, the slow rise and fall of her breath, the flick of her tail, the way her ears turned toward every sound. The world beyond the doorway glowed silver, quiet and empty. It was a new day, but danger felt close, as if the storm had only washed it deeper into the soil. Nathaniel rose carefully, stretching sore limbs. His clothes were stiff with dried mud. He moved to Grace and laid a hand on her neck. "Morning, girl," he whispered. "We made it through the night." She blinked at him, then nudged his shoulder gently as if to remind him they still had far to go. He found a patch of grass and let her graze while he walked down to the creek. The water was clear, cold and fast, tumbling over smooth stones. He cupped it in his hands and drank, letting it wash the dryness from his throat. For the first time in days, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the rippling surface. It looked like freedom itself, bright, unreachable, yet close enough to touch. As he knelt there, he thought again of the world beyond these woods. North, that word had become his prayer. Somewhere north lay the promise whispered through the cabins, passed from one slave to another like a secret flame, places where no man could be owned, where the law of chains ended at the river's edge. He didn't know how far that place was, or even if it truly existed, but he believed in it now because he had to. Belief was the only thing that kept him standing. When Grace had finished grazing, he returned to her and brushed the dirt from her coat with his hands. The motion calmed him. "We'll follow the river," he said softly. "It'll take us north. Maybe to someone who'll help." They set off before the sun climbed too high. The path was narrow, overgrown and wet from the storm. Every few steps, Nathaniel looked behind him, half expecting to see figures rising from the fog. But there was only the whisper of wind and the steady rhythm of hooves on soft ground. The river wound like a silver snake beside them, glinting through the trees. Birds called from the branches above, their songs sharp and strange after so many nights filled with thunder. By midday they came to a bend where the forest opened into a wide clearing. In the distance, faint columns of smoke rose into the sky. A settlement or maybe another plantation. Nathaniel's stomach tightened. He led Grace into the shadows, keeping low. Through the leaves he saw wooden fences, a few cabins and men moving about with rifles slung across their shoulders. He waited until they disappeared from sight before leading Grace back to the river. His hands trembled as he tightened her rope. "We stay close to the water," he whispered. No roads, no people. The afternoon passed in silence. The heat grew heavy again, pressing down on them until even the insects went quiet. Sweat ran down Nathaniel's neck. His back still burned from old wounds. Every step sent pain crawling up his spine, but he pushed forward. At one point he thought he heard voices behind him, faint, distant. He froze, holding his breath. Grace's ears flicked toward the sound. Then the wind shifted, carrying the echo away. Only the river remained, endless and calm. When dusk began to fall, they found shelter under a cluster of cypress trees. Nathaniel built a small fire from dry twigs. The smoke curled upward, thin and gray. He shared a few wild berries with Grace, laughing softly when she tried to nuzzle them from his hand. "You're greedy," he said, his voice weak with exhaustion. The light faded to blue. Fireflies drifted over the water like sparks from heaven. Nathaniel leaned back against a tree and closed his eyes. For a moment, he thought he could hear his mother's voice again, singing in the soft rhythm of the river. He mouthed the words without sound, feeling them more than speaking them. He must have dozed because when he opened his eyes again, the moon was high and bright. The forest shimmered in silver. Grace stood quietly beside him, watching something across the river. Her ears were pricked, her body tense. Nathaniel rose slowly. "What is it?" He followed her gaze. On the far bank, faint shapes moved among the trees. His heart clenched. Torchlight flickered, glowing orange against the darkness. The voices came next, low, deliberate, searching. "They found us," he whispered. Grace snorted softly, stamping her hoof. Nathaniel grabbed her rope and looked around. The river here was narrower than before, but deep, its surface dark and cold. The current whispered like a warning. He had only seconds to decide. Run into the woods and risk the open ground, or cross again, vanish into the other side before the men could reach the shore. He tightened his grip on the rope. "We're not going back," he said. The torches grew brighter. A shout echoed across the water. Then came the bark of a dog. "Now," he whispered. He led Grace into the shallows. The water bit like ice. The current was faster here, dragging at his legs. Grace hesitated, but Nathaniel pulled gently on the rope. "Trust me," he said, voice trembling. Just one more river, Grace. They moved deeper. The water climbed to his chest, then his neck. Grace swam, powerful and sure, her body cutting through the current. Nathaniel clung to her mane, teeth chattering. Behind them, torches flared brighter. He could hear men shouting orders, the crack of branches as they pushed through the brush. Halfway across, lightning split the sky, not from a storm, but from a rifle shot. The bullet struck the water near them with a hiss. Nathaniel flinched, ducking low. Grace snorted and surged forward, panic in her eyes. Another shot followed, then another. "Go, girl," Nathaniel shouted. "Go!" The river roared around them. The current tore at his grip, pulling him sideways. He felt his hand slip from her mane. Cold swallowed him. For a moment he was underwater, tumbling blind through darkness. His lungs burned. He kicked, desperate, until his head broke the surface again. "Grace!" he gasped. The horse was ahead, fighting the current. She turned her head toward his voice and whinnied. Nathaniel reached for her, but the river pulled harder. Then she moved closer, forcing her way through the water until he caught the rope again. Together they pushed forward inch by inch, until at last her hooves struck solid ground. She climbed onto the far bank, sides heaving, water streaming from her coat. Nathaniel crawled after her, coughing, trembling. He collapsed beside her, gasping for air. His chest burned, his arms felt like lead. Grace lowered her head, nuzzling his shoulder. He pressed his face against her wet mane and sobbed, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, terrible joy of being alive. The shouts from across the river grew faint. The men had stopped at the edge, unwilling to cross the current in darkness. Nathaniel listened until their voices faded completely. "We did it," he whispered. "We made it again." He lay there until his breathing steadied. The moon climbed higher, painting the world in pale light. The river murmured behind them, carrying away the sound of pursuit. When he finally stood, his legs were shaking. Grace stood beside him, drenched but strong, her breath steaming in the cool air. Nathaniel touched her neck gently. "You saved me again," he said. "You always do." They followed a faint trail into the woods, moving slowly. The ground rose toward higher land, and soon they found a hollow between two great oaks. Nathaniel gathered branches and built another small fire. He hung his wet shirt near the flames and sat close, shivering. Grace grazed nearby, tearing at the grass with quiet patience. Nathaniel watched her, his heart heavy with gratitude and fear. How many more nights like this could they survive? The fire crackled softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stone he had carried since the plantation, smooth and white, no bigger than a coin. It was the only thing he had kept from his mother's cabin. He turned it over in his palm, the warmth of the fire reflecting in its surface. "I think you'd be proud, Ma," he whispered. "I'm still running." I didn't stop. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke downstream. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. Grace lifted her head, listening. Nathaniel stared into the flames, their light dancing in his eyes. He thought of the stories Isaac used to tell, about the Underground Railroad, about people who risked their lives to help strangers. Maybe, he thought, they were real. Maybe they were out there somewhere, lighting candles in the windows of safe houses along the northern trails. He wanted to believe that. He needed to. As the fire died down, he lay beside it, one arm draped across his chest, the other resting on the rope still tied loosely to Grace's neck. He felt her warmth beside him, steady and alive. Sleep came slowly, carrying him into dreams where he stood on open ground under a vast sky. No chains, no whips, no names shouted in anger, only the wind and the sound of hooves running free. When morning came, the forest was silent again. Mist rose from the river like breath. Nathaniel stirred and opened his eyes. Grace stood nearby, grazing peacefully. The sky was soft grey, promising rain again, but he didn't mind. He stood and looked toward the north. Somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the rivers yet to cross, lay the world he had dreamed of since he was a child, a world his mother had believed in. He reached for the rope, smiling faintly. "Come on, Grace," he said. "We're not done yet." The horse lifted her head, her eyes bright in the morning light. Together they turned toward the path that wound deeper into the unknown, leaving the river behind them, a ribbon of silver that marked the place where a slave had almost died, and where for the first time he had truly begun to live. The road north was not a road at all, but a ribbon of dirt winding through fields and forest, sometimes fading into nothing before reappearing again miles ahead. For Nathaniel, every step felt heavier, yet his spirit burned brighter. The river was behind them now, and with it the ghosts of the past. Ahead lay only sky and distance, open and uncertain. Grace moved slower than before. Her body bore the marks of their journey, cuts on her legs, ribs showing beneath her coat. Still, she walked without complaint, her ears twitching to the rhythm of the wind. Nathaniel often walked beside her, one hand resting on her neck, speaking softly as though to keep them both awake. "Almost there," he said, though he didn't know where there was. He only knew it was somewhere beyond the horizon. Somewhere better. Days blurred together. They crossed narrow streams, climbed low hills, and past abandoned farms where weeds grew through broken fences. Sometimes Nathaniel found an apple or a handful of wild corn. Other nights they ate nothing at all. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but the thought of stopping scared him more than the emptiness. By the third day, Grace's gait had become uneven. Her front leg trembled each time she stepped. Nathaniel noticed and stopped to rest her beneath a sycamore tree. He brushed her coat gently, whispering words of comfort he barely believed. "You've done more than any man ever could, girl. You can rest a bit." She lowered her head, breathing slow and heavy. Nathaniel sat beside her, his back against the tree. The forest was quiet except for the hum of insects. His eyelids grew heavy, but he fought the pull of sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the plantation, the chains, the faces, the whip. He didn't want to dream of that place anymore. As night approached, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and something sweet, bread maybe. Nathaniel's stomach clenched. He climbed the small rise ahead, crouching low. Through the trees he saw a cabin, small, lonely, a single light flickering in the window. Smoke curled from the chimney. He turned back to Grace. "Maybe we'll find food," he said. Maybe kindness, but kindness was a dangerous hope. He remembered Isaac's words. "The world don't favor kindness, boy. It favors obedience." Still, hunger pushed him forward. He led Grace quietly toward the cabin, keeping to the shadows. The door was half open. From inside came the faint sound of a woman's voice humming. He knocked once softly. The humming stopped. "Who's there?" a voice called. Nathaniel hesitated. "Just a traveler," he said. "We mean no harm." The door creaked wider. A woman stepped out, holding a lantern. Her face was lined but kind, her eyes sharp beneath a grey kerchief. She looked from Nathaniel to the horse behind him, then back to his torn clothes and hollow eyes. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "You're running, aren't you?" Nathaniel said nothing, but the answer was in his silence. She glanced over her shoulder, then motioned quickly. "Come inside." Before someone sees, he followed her into the small cabin. The warmth hit him like sunlight. The smell of bread filled the air. She set the lantern on the table and looked him over again. "My name's Martha," she said. "You got a name, boy?" "Nathaniel," he replied. She nodded. "Well, Nathaniel, you're lucky this night. There's bread and soup on the stove. Sit before you fall." He wanted to thank her, but his throat was tight. He sat trembling as she filled a bowl and handed it to him. The first spoonful burned his tongue, but he didn't care. Tears welled in his eyes. "Easy now," Martha said gently. "'Tain't no rush." Grace stood outside under the eaves, shaking rain from her coat. Martha glanced at the window. "That your horse?" "Yes, ma'am." "Her name's Grace. She looks half-starved." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "So am I." Martha chuckled softly, then turned serious. "You can rest here tonight. But come morning, you need to move north. There's a man near Mill Creek. Name's Reverend Turner. He helps folks like you. You follow the river till it bends west, you'll find his farm. He'll take you the rest of the way." Nathaniel lowered his spoon. "You're not afraid to help me?" "I've been afraid all my life," she said quietly. "Fear don't feed the soul. Doing right does." Her words filled the room with a warmth deeper than fire. He slept that night on the floor by the hearth, Grace tied safely behind the cabin where she could graze. The rain came again, soft and steady. Nathaniel dreamed of his mother, her hands brushing his hair, her voice saying, "Find the light." When he woke, dawn was already pale through the window. Martha stood at the table, wrapping food in a cloth. "Take this," she said. "Bread, dried apples." "Not much, but enough." He tried to speak, but she stopped him. "No thanks needed. Just promise me you'll keep going." "I will." "Then God go with you." He led Grace back to the path. The air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke. When he looked back, Martha was still standing in the doorway, one hand raised. He lifted his in return, then turned toward the north. The road wound through rolling hills and thickets of pine. Hours passed. The sky grew heavy again with clouds. Nathaniel's legs trembled with fatigue, but he didn't stop. Each step brought them closer to something he had never known, safety. By afternoon, they reached Mill Creek. The water was high and brown from recent rains. Across the bank, a small farmhouse stood among the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney, and a man in a long coat worked near the fence. Nathaniel hesitated, then called softly. "Sir." The man turned. His face was stern, lined with age, but his eyes softened when he saw them. He walked closer, boots splashing through the mud. "You must be the boy Martha sent," he said. Nathaniel nodded, startled. "She told you?" "She sent word ahead yesterday," the man said. "I'm Reverend Turner. You're safe here for a while." He helped Nathaniel lead Grace into the barn where clean hay waited. The horse sighed as if in relief. Turner patted her neck. "Fine creature. Strong heart. She deserves rest." Nathaniel smiled weakly. "She's the reason I'm still alive." Turner looked at him with quiet understanding. "Then she's done God's work." They ate together that evening, simple stew and bread. Turner spoke little, asking only what Nathaniel planned next. "I don't know," Nathaniel admitted. "Just north." Turner nodded. "There are people who'll take you farther. I'll see that you meet them. But you must rest first. You've come through fire and water both." Nathaniel looked down at his hands. "It feels like I've been running all my life." "Then let this be where the running ends," Turner said softly. That night Nathaniel slept in the loft above the barn. The rain returned, drumming gently on the roof. Below, Grace stood in her stall, breathing slow and steady. The sound comforted him more than words ever could. When dawn came, a strange stillness filled the air. Turner was already awake, harnessing a wagon. "We'll leave after breakfast," he said. "I'll take you to the next stop myself. 2 days' ride. After that you'll be free." The word hung in the air, free. Nathaniel repeated it silently, afraid it might vanish if spoken aloud. But as he saddled Grace, he noticed her breathing was heavier than before. Her legs trembled when she moved. He frowned and stroked her muzzle. "You tired, girl?" She blinked slowly, her head lowering. Turner watched from the doorway. "She's worn out, son. You've pushed her far." "I can't leave her," Nathaniel said. Turner shook his head. "I'm not asking you to. But maybe let her rest. The Lord gives every soul its limits." Nathaniel led Grace outside, the morning light soft on her coat. She took a few steps, then faltered. He caught her neck, panic rising. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "You're all right." But she wasn't. Her breath came shallow and quick. Her knees buckled. He tried to steady her, but her weight pulled him down. She sank slowly to the ground, her eyes half closed. "Grace," he cried. Turner hurried over, but one look told him all he needed to know. "She's done, son," he said quietly. "She's given all she had." Nathaniel knelt beside her, his hands shaking. "No, she can't, not now. Grace lifted her head one last time, pressing her muzzle against his chest. Her eyes met his, calm, unafraid. Then her breath stilled. The world seemed to stop. Rain began to fall again, soft as tears. Nathaniel bowed his head over her and wept. All the miles, all the pain, all the hope that had carried them here, it broke inside him like a wave. He stayed that way until the rain turned to mist and the sun began to rise again. Turner laid a hand on his shoulder. "She brought you home, Nathaniel. You honor her by living." Together they buried Grace beneath the willow tree by the creek. Turner carved her name into a piece of wood and set it at the head of the grave. Grace, Nathaniel placed the smooth white stone from his mother's cabin beside it. "So you won't be alone," he whispered. For a long time he stood there, the river murmuring behind him, the willow leaves brushing the water like a lullaby. He thought of his mother, of Isaac, of Martha, and all the nameless souls who had walked before him. He felt them in the wind, in the soil, in the steady heartbeat of the earth. When he finally turned back, the sun was breaking through the clouds. The world shone wet and golden. Turner waited by the wagon, reins in hand. "You ready?" he asked. Nathaniel nodded. "I think I am." As the wagon rolled north, he looked back one last time. The willow swayed gently over Grace's grave. A single ray of sunlight fell upon it, bright as a blessing. He smiled through his tears. "Thank you," he whispered. The road ahead curved toward the open fields. Beyond them lay freedom, not as a dream, but as a life waiting to be lived. And as the morning wind rose, carrying the scent of river water and rain, Nathaniel felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. He was no longer the boy from the stables, no longer the runaway in chains. He was simply Nathaniel, free and alive, and forever bound to the memory of the horse who had carried him to salvation.